One of the curators here at Shetland Museum and Archives, and I'm really pleased to see all of you here today. As you may know, we're actually filming this, and this is being broadcast live across the world. So I welcome everyone who's tuning in as well. Just a few housekeeping things before we start. Fire exits, there's one here, and of course through the doors here, and the muster point is in that direction. Please, could you turn off mobile phones if you haven't already? There's coffee out here, but we'd ask that you try not to go out during the break for coffee, or during the talks for coffee. And of course, the toilets are just here on your right. I think that's about all of that we need. There'll be 3 speakers this morning, and then we'll have a fairly early lunch, and then we'll come back for the afternoon session. You may have noticed in the foyer there's an exhibition that's related to this event, and that's going to run for a couple more weeks, but please have a look at that during the breaks if you wish. I'm going to be speaking about that myself, and if you have questions about it, of course, you can ask me at any point. I'd like to introduce Lynn. First of all, I'll say a little bit about this project that we've been doing. This event is the very last one in a series called Knitting in the Round, and there were other events happening throughout Scotland. And this was organized by Lynn Abrams, Marina Moskovitz, and Rosalind Chapman at University of Glasgow, and they invited me to be part of the committee for that. And so we had a discussion at the point of the funding application and thought we should talk about authenticity in Shetland knitting because it's an issue that keeps coming up over and over again. We're sort of focused on lace today a little bit because of Rosalind's research, her PhD in the Shetland lace industry, and hence the project that you see out here in the foyer. So I'd like to introduce Lynn, Professor Lynn Abrams from University of Glasgow, and I think I'll just let you carry on.
Thanks. Thank you ever so much, Carol. It's really lovely to be here again. Thank you very much for organising this, Rosalind and Carol, and thank you, all of you, for coming along. And as Carol said, this study day is the last event in the Knitting in the Round network, and I'd just like to acknowledge the very generous support of the Royal Society of Edinburgh for sponsoring our research over the last few years into knitting in Scotland. And it's really fitting that we are here in Shetland because this is where our project started. Back in the 1990s, I'm going to take you on a little journey just to start off. Back in the 1990s, I came to Shetland for the very first time. In fact, I came with my husband who was researching up Heliar, and I got so excited about Shetland and Shetland women and gender relations in Shetland that I decided to research the history of women in these islands, and that took me off on a really exciting and enriching journey to research the social and cultural and economic history of Shetland through the lens of women and through the lens of gender. And of course, in studying women here, I had to investigate knitting as a central element of the domestic economy and of the social and economic networks of women. So that's where this whole project really has its origins. In the 19th and 20th century, of course, many of you know, the economy of knitting, from the ruing of the sheep to the trading of the knitwear, was facilitated by female networks. Female networks of spinners, of knitters, of dyers, of finishers, and so on and so forth. And the production of knitwear forged these female networks, and the female networks enabled the knitting industry to operate. So we have a kind of big circular process centred on the production of knitwear in Shetland. Now, the project that Rosalind and Carol have been running for the last few months Seems like a lot longer, to be honest, Rosalind. In some respects, I think, mimics those women's networks. When Rosalind put out the call for knitters to knit up samples from 19th century so-called Shetland lace patterns, she tapped in to an international network of knitters. And you'll see, if you have a look at the exhibition out in the foyer, you'll see many of the names of the people who knitted those samples. They're from all over the place. So this international network of knitters were keen to test out the patterns and to help us answer some questions about authenticity in Shetland lace. And in holding this study day here, this project has really come home. As the work of knitters from around the world is displayed in the museum foyer and is the object of our discussions today. So in this sense, Knitting in the Round, the title of our RSE network, is a really appropriate title. So I think I can speak on behalf of Marina too, would like to thank Rosalind and Carol very, very much for the immense amount of work that went into coordinating this project. And Carol's going to talk about it in some detail later on. But I know that very, very large numbers of knitters participated in the end. The second impetus for this study day is, of course, Rosalind Chapman's research on the history of Shetland hand-knitted lace. This was a project that was actually cooked up by me and Carol in a room upstairs here somewhere to attract some money, really, to go on and do some research on Shetland knitting. So what we ended up with was our HRC studentship that would enable the University of Glasgow and Shetland Museum to collaborate on this project. And I think Rosalind did us proud. She's engaged with the community of knitters and custodians of lace here in Shetland and around the country more generally and overseas. And of course, her research uncovered an incredibly rich archival history of Shetland lace knitting. So we very much hope that we will see some of that research in print in the not too distant future. And Rosalind's going to be talking about some of her research today. So, as I said at the start, this study day is the final event in a long-running project based at the University of Glasgow. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of a background of some of the things that we've been doing over the past few years. So our aims were to use hand knitting as a case study of the role of craft in linking individual creativity to economic pursuits. More generally in the context of textile production in Scotland being a really major contributor to the Scottish economy. We also wanted to link local design traditions to national heritage and to link domestic economies to the creative economy of Scotland. And in running a series of workshops at Glasgow and a number of other venues, we alighted upon these three themes: sustainability, creativity, and authenticity, which seemed to be themes that pulled out of all the different strands of discussion that we were having with historians, with heritage professionals, with present-day entrepreneurs in knitwear, with designers and with makers. And all of them were excited about the revival of knitting in popular culture, which we've seen over the last few years, and also the revival of knitting in mainstream and high-end fashion. But also they were very, very concerned about issues around the sustainability of the industry, and particularly issues around the training of young people in the knitwear industry and the maintenance of skills. So we seem to have been running workshops and study days and events actually for a good number of years now with knitting at the very focus. And all of our activities, I think, have combined the academic with the participatory. So we've really tried to bring on board not just academics with a scholarly interest in craft and in skill and in textiles in particular, but in everything we've done, we've managed to pull in to our events what I would call ordinary knitters out there, people with incredible knowledge and with incredible skill around knitting. Much more skill than me, it has to be said, whose little sample didn't even make it into the exhibition out there. It's pretty poor. And we recognise that really exciting things happen in this sphere of research when researchers speak to those who actually practice the skill, who do it on the ground, so to speak. So it's not just people like me who will sit in an archive and conduct research at a rather sort of dry level. The really exciting stuff happens, and the really new insights occur when you engage with people who really understand what they're doing. It's called practice-based research, I understand. So here's a series of events that we've run over the past few years, and I'm going to run through them. You'll be glad to see that we've got a few illustrations. So the first slightly crazy event that we decided on was to knit the flags of the Commonwealth. The idea, obviously, was to raise the profile of our project and of knitting during the Commonwealth Games when they took place in Glasgow a couple of years ago. And what you'll see here is the flags arrayed along the Glasgow University railings. If you know the University of Glasgow and University Avenue, you'll recognise that. And this was during the men's cycling road race. Mostly in the pouring rain, so they actually got really quite soggy. But it was a fantastic project, and it really demonstrated that value of pulling together both academics and the community of knitters out there, particularly right across the University of Glasgow. So we had staff and students who volunteered to knit a flag or more than one flag of the Commonwealth. And of course, as you can see from some of these illustrations, some of those flags weren't particularly easy to knit, particularly any of those who had a sort of Union flag embedded in a whole array of symbols and so on. So really, really quite a tricky project. But I think we pretty much knitted all the flags, and we still have them, and I think they might still be on display in the round reading room at the university. Our second project was to employ a knitter in residence at the university. And again, part of this was to raise the profile of knitting as a skill and as an important domestic craft, particularly embedded in Scottish culture. We wanted to raise the profile of that right across the university. So we used the University of Glasgow as a creative inspiration, really, for a series of new knitting designs. We employed Susan McComb, who was a graduate of Glasgow School of Art, and she came up with a whole series of really, really lovely patterns which were taking inspiration from the architecture of the university. So some of these reference the windows of the university, some of them reference the ornate Gothic stonework. So she came up with a series of designs, mapped out the patterns, sourced some lovely Scottish yarns from Jameson and Smith here in Shetland. Here are the blues and whites were the Jameson and Smith, and also from New Lanark, who are also producing, as you probably know, their own knitting yarns. And she taught lots of people to knit, and also more particularly, as you can see here, taught a whole class of archaeologists to engage in knitting. So that was a really, really exciting and productive project, I think. And at the end of that project, we ended up producing a rather nice booklet that contains the designs and some of the images. Our second study day was on knitting in wartime, and you can see a kind of pattern here where we're keying in to all the most important events that are happening over the last couple of years. So this really was keying into the World War I commemoration. And I suppose this particular study day, which was held at the Lighthouse in Glasgow, enabled us to focus on women's work during wartime. And we heard some very interesting talks around women's knitting of socks and a whole other series of garments, both for servicemen and also for more general use. And in that project, we tried to work quite closely with Glasgow Women's Library, located in Glasgow, and they have a rather lovely knitting pattern collection. So we really want to work with them a bit more in the future. Our second study day was held in the town of Sanquhar in Dumfriesshire, and some of you in this room were at that event. And that event was really a case study of how a traditional, or if you like, authentic design is being translated into a modern business model. So we not only found out a lot more about the production and the design of the very distinctive Sanquhar patterns, most normally knitted into gloves, but also hats and scarves and so on. So we found out about that, and the very few people are in that area of Dumfriesshire who are still knitting those items. But we also found out about a really interesting project where the local community is developing a small community cooperative and machine knitting Sanquhar design scarves and gloves and hats and so on to produce, both for local people but also, I think, for the tourist industry. And perhaps in many ways, Shetland might be a model for the ways in which this small community can use its very distinctive knitwear to promote tourism and local skills. And finally, we quite crazily held a huge conference in Glasgow last August, I think it was. One of the series of the In the Loop conferences. There has been at least one, if not two, In the Loop conferences in Shetland. They've also been held in Winchester. We brought the event to Glasgow. I think it was a great success. Here are some images with some familiar Shetland faces. In the Loop From Craft to Couture, where the issues around authenticity, I think, were very much to the fore in the papers that we heard, especially in the presentations that were given by knitwear designers, present-day knitwear designers and producers like Rosie Aribe, and at the bottom of the slide there is it's a kind of melange of Rosie Aribe's knitwear. Rosie Aribe and also Di Gilpin, both of whom, in very, very different ways, translate and transform traditional designs to the modern form. And this was showcased in our Scottish knitwear fashion show. And I have a whole series of rather lovely professional photograph images of the fashion show, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we were able to foreground at that event. So what you'll see are some modern knitwear designs that you might recognise, and I can just give you a few more here. Designs by Kate Davis. This is a Kate Davis. By Di Gilpin, by Jade Starmore, by Rosie Aribe, and a whole series of others, which are all very modern takes on traditional designs and techniques. I think I have a few more, and this is I think this is a Di Gilpin, rather lovely red and black, and this is a Kate Davis. So this brings me really full circle to the theme of the study day today, which is authenticity. And as I said at the conference in the summer, we talked a bit about authenticity and what that might mean in the knitwear context. And I'm not going to say very much at all about it today because it's just not my research field. And I have no idea how people might define authenticity. I had a bit of a quick think when I was putting this talk together, and it might include some of these terms: local, traditional, whatever that might mean, real, authentic, sincere, might be culturally grounded, indigenous, handmade, static or unchanging. But what might this mean in the Shetland context? Does it mean that an item has to be made from Shetland yarn, from Shetland sheep? Does it have to be spun in Shetland? Does it have to be hand knitted or frame knitted in Shetland? Designed in Shetland, using traditional Shetland knitting patterns? Maybe all of those things. Why is this an issue for knitters and for knitting? Well, in a world in which distinction matters, I think it does in the market, authenticity perhaps lends an item superior advantage in market conditions. There are a whole series, I think, of economic and cultural claims to authenticity in an era of intense competition and also marketisation, where everything has a value, economic or otherwise. So there are a whole series of questions, I think, that are going to be raised today around what counts as authentic and what does authenticity mean. A couple of images here just to get people thinking, I suppose. Here again is that image of Rosie Uribe's rather gorgeous knitwear. Of course, some of that is hand knitted and some of it isn't. Quite a lot is machine knitted in factories using, if you like, traditional designs but very modern colours and colourways. And some of the small items are hand knitted. The other image is a pair of gloves that I'm knitting at the moment, based on a Hazel Tyndall pattern, using Shetland wool, very clearly hand knitted by me, but of course not by a Shetlander and not in Shetland. I don't know whether you take that as authentic or not. Depends on how they turn out, I guess. So what are we going to do next? We really want to continue this project. Roslyn is currently scoping archives in the Scottish borders, and we're developing a network with textile and knit curators and archaeologists and historians across Northern Europe. We really want to develop the project further beyond Shetland and perhaps beyond Scotland. I think there's still very, very much to know about the histories of hand knitting. There's still much to find out about the vectors of influence in design and in technique. There's still much to find out about local and national economies of hand knitting. There's still a lot to find out about the relationship between knitting heritage and today's modern knitting economies. I think the really, really positive thing to come out of all of this and to end on for me is to say that knitting might be a traditional craft that almost anyone can practice, and because of that it remains a living skill with a vibrant presence both in the home and in the community and in the business and in the market, and perhaps for this reason knitting will survive. Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to seg smoothly into Carol, who will talk about the knitting authenticity and Shetland lace knitting project that Carol and Roslyn have been running for probably 6 months or so, I think it feels like it. So many of you, all of you, I'm sure will know Carol. Carol is curator of textiles here at Shetland Museum and the author of a rather gorgeous book that I've just noted on tatted rugs.
Thank you.
Over to you, Carol.
Okay.
Right.
And I need your help with my visual.
Oh, okay. If I go back,
Yep,
where are you going to put it?
just there.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Oh. Right, thanks Lynn, and for a really good overview of where this project has slotted in now to the Knitting in the Round series. In 2008, I attended the first In the Loop conference at Winchester School of Art. Lynn was mentioning that the fourth one was in Glasgow, but I was lucky enough to go to the very first one. And during that conference, Naomi Tarrant, who had been textile curator at the National Museum Scotland, presented a paper about Jane Gauguin, the 19th century Edinburgh-based writer of knitting books. I was inspired by her talk. And I spent an afternoon at the Winchester School of Art's Knitting Reference Library. And I went through 4 archive boxes full of 19th century knitting books. Most of these had been donated by Richard Rutt, and he's the author of History of Hand Knitting, and sadly passed away last year. And his collection of these books remains one of the largest and the best preserved in Britain. A considerable number of the books had so-called Shetland lace patterns in them. And I had a lot of questions after looking at these patterns. Were these stitches really Shetland lace? They didn't have any images, so it was hard to say. What was the author's relationship to Shetland? How did these patterns appear in books published so early in the history of Shetland lace? And were there many more books like these? A year later, I was given a small research grant from Museums Gallery Scotland to examine other collections of 19th century pattern books held by the National Library of Scotland, the British Library, and the National Art Library at the V&A. I discovered more patterns called Shetland, and the books contain information about Shetland wool lace yarn. A few of the books had drawings of the stitch patterns, but most of them did not. Without knowing what the patterns looked like, it was not possible to compare them with 19th century Shetland lace pieces held in our collection. In 2010, Lynn Abrams, as she mentioned, approached me about an AHRC-funded PhD studentship. She asked me what topic related to Shetland history would be most suitable for such an in-depth study. I answered by saying the fine lace industry. We knew very little about it, other than the knitwear we had in the collection and the system of truck, which affected all knitters. My questions were, how extensive was the knitted lace industry? Who participated in it? Was it really an industry? How did it affect women's lives and households in Shetland? Rosalind Chapman was chosen as a candidate, and during the following years, Rosalind and I have had many conversations about 19th century pattern books and their significance to the history of Shetland lace. We're here today as part of the continuation of our own separate strands of research. The published pattern books were always a bit of a conundrum to us. They seem to sit apart from existing Shetland lace collections because it has always been widely held that Shetland knitters did not use patterns. They may have jotted notes or referred to their own pattern libraries, as these aids survive from the second half of the 20th century in our collection, but no such pieces exist from the early 19th century. The knitting itself became a record, of course, and although lace garments were traded away from Shetland, the amount of knitting done must have cemented the most common patterns and stitch counts in the minds of knitters. Nevertheless, lace knit in Shetland seems to have been made without patterns, and there is no record that published pattern books were used by professional lace knitters in Shetland. The early published books were marketed to British hobby knitters. These were 19th century ladies who did not knit for a living. They had leisure time and they chose to spend it knitting and doing other types of needlecraft. The language of the books suggests knitting was widespread and hobby knitters were eager for patterns. Some of the patterns and later entire books were specifically devoted to items for charity. But by and large, the pattern books were aimed at Victorian women making soft furnishings, garments, and dress accessories for their homes, their families, and for themselves. Rosalind and I wanted to know more about the patterns referred to as Shetland. Between us, we had looked at a large number of the books. During the course of her PhD research, many of the books I had had to consult in person became digitized and available on the internet. This made many patterns available to us for the first time. We knew the key to understanding the Shetland patterns was to see them, but first they had to be knit. To this end, I decided to spend my spare time working out the patterns. Best laid plans. But we soon realized this would take far too long for the many patterns we wished to understand, and of course the pace of my own knitting. Rosalind appealed to knitters at the University of Glasgow who had previously been so enthusiastic about other knitting in the round events. Emails were sent out, and within the first 24 hours, 293 knitters had responded. This was far more than we thought we needed, and the recruitment of knitters was capped at that, although a further 165 knitters had come forward. Rosalind made separate PDF files of the Shetland patterns we wished to study, and these were emailed to knitters. The knit samples and completed comment sheets were sent to Rosalind in Glasgow, who painstakingly transcribed comments onto a massive spreadsheet of knitter data, which we shared over Dropbox. She also labeled each of the samples before sending them to me in Shetland. Over the course of several months, large and small envelopes of knit samples arrived on my desk. I organized them by 19th century author and pattern, and then set about studying them. From these, a short list of examples were selected for the exhibition. The patterns we originally chose to have knitted were selected from many of the earliest books and by a range of authors. We focused mainly on single patterns, although we also chose a few whole garments, hoping that some knitters would oblige. The same pattern was sent to a number of knitters, since it was important to see the patterns in different yarns and gauges, knit by differently skilled knitters. We advised the knitter to consider the pattern writer's suggestion of yarn and needle size, and only asked that the samples not be made in bulky or fuzzy yarns. Ultimately, these choices were left to the knitter, since the pattern recommendations were often difficult to interpret. We asked knitters to knit the patterns as they were written, mistakes and all, and to make note of problems following the pattern. A few people struggled with some of the awkward terminology, but most knitters seemed able to understand the archaic wording and the complicated coding of the patterns. Many knitters charted the patterns, making it easier for themselves to knit, and they submitted the charts along with their notes and swatch. Some knitters encountered mistakes in patterns. All the knitters who tried Jackson's 1845 transparent pattern for Shetland shawls and scarves did not get very far. Each row from the third row onwards has more decreases than yarn over increases, so that the pattern knits to an ever-decreasing triangle. Some knitters submitted more than one sample or a pattern when mistakes could be worked out, or patterns offered variable interpretations. All of the samples that came back for Copley's pattern 83 for a Shetland shawl were this shape, although there is no indication in the pattern to expect this. One wonders how many parallelogram shawls were created using this pattern in the 19th century. Tiffany Fournier chose to tackle the entire Gauguin shawl, as you see here. This was no mean feat, because Gauguin used her own form of pattern coding, which would have given even Bletchley Park experts pause. In total then, 137 knitters actively participated and knit us 282 samples. Now I'll talk a little bit about the Shetland patterns. The pattern books contain a large number of different patterns sourced from different knitting traditions. Andalusian, Russian, German, Turkish, and Alpine knitting designs are represented, but so too is Shetland. It's clear that as early as 1842, when both Jane Gauguin and Frances Lambert published patterns for Shetland shawls for the first time, fine Shetland open work or lace knitting had become a recognized brand. The word Shetland in the title of a knitting pattern meant something to the author and the knitter, but what? Miss Watts of Islington provided a pattern and drawing of a Shetland wool ruffle in her 1845 publication, The Illustrated Knitting, Netting, and Crochet Book. It is not clear what relationship the ruffle has with Shetland, and Watts does not even suggest using Shetland wool to make them. Knitters who received this pattern were not sent the drawing, by the way, since we did not want this to influence how they knit the pattern. The finished ruffles, knit by Susan Freeman with Shetland lace weight, are lovely, but there does not seem to be anything inherently Shetland about the design. And these are on display out in the foyer. 3 variations of leaf-shaped patterns from the mid-19th century were produced by our volunteers. Copley's 1849 pattern 110, Riego's 1846 shawl pattern, and Lambert's 1846 leaf pattern were either called Shetland or recommended for Shetland shawls. These motifs are not represented in lace knitting from Shetland Museum's collection, and their description as Shetland remains a mystery. The 2 earliest published patterns called Shetland, both dated 1842, are from Lambert and Gauguin. Lambert provides no descriptive information at the beginning of her pattern for a Shetland shawl. The motif is a rather simple one, just a 6-stitch repeat over 8 rows. This motif and variations of it were published by a number of authors in the following years, including Cooper and Copley, of which the latter includes a mistake. All of the authors called the pattern Shetland, which suggests it was used in Shetland-made garments during the middle of the 19th century. This is a simple mesh-like stitch, variations of which have been used in more simple forms of Shetland lace knitting or as fillers within other motifs, but it is not common in existing lace from the 19th century. Copley's pattern 86 for a Shetland shawl has similarities in a scarf made by Mina Rendell, a 20th century knitter with Unst connections. Note, however, that in the Copley pattern, the reverse side rows are purled, whereas the Shetland motif is knit back. This is the most common difference between the 19th century published patterns and Shetland patterns of similar design. Lambert provides an example of a well-known Shetland pattern, which she calls Leaf and Trellis, and is listed as pattern 5 of her 1846 Shetland shawl patterns. In Shetland, it is a common lace pattern called De Print ou de Wave. Gauguin published this pattern 4 years earlier, but she did not title it Shetland. However, her introductory remarks about the pattern provide clues about Shetland shawls available in 1842. She writes, "This shawl is exactly in appearance like the Shetland shawls, only the center stitch is more novel than any of them I have ever seen." We cannot tell from her wording whether Gauguin was offering a version of an established Shetland stitch, or whether she was claiming the stitch as her own. I would suggest the former interpretation, that she had seen the center and border stitches in a lace shawl made in Shetland, and she is presenting a version of the Shetland stitch for the center. And remember, Gauguin's based in Edinburgh, right in the middle of Edinburgh, where she has a shop. So she has access to all kinds of Shetland lace coming her way. In the pattern, she offers 3 options for the reverse side rows. The knitter may purl back, as was done in this sample and the complete shawl to my right. Alternatively, the knitter may choose to leave out the plain knit rows altogether, or, Gauguin suggests, they may be worked as knit stitches, like the Shetland shawls. Her recommended version is for the reverse side rows to be purled, creating a front and back side to the garment, as you see here. This is probably her novel version of the Shetland stitch. In Shetland knit versions, as these two stoles from our collection show, the reverse side rows were knit, creating a fabric which was the same on both sides. The Shetland version is also faster to knit, a concern for the island's professional knitters, but of less importance for the hobby knitter. One of the difficulties in researching early 19th century Shetland lace patterns is the lack of material in collections known to date from this period. We have a large number of lace pieces securely dated to the later part of the 19th century, especially from the 1880s onwards. We have a reasonably good photographic record of lace from this period too. It is lucky that glass plate negatives taken by Magnus Sutherland between 1895 and 1900 survive, since he recorded many of the complex large shawls made by members of his family. But many lace garments come to us with no solid provenance, and it is very difficult to date these pieces with any precision. At best, we can record stitches to build up a picture of the range of stitches used and their frequency. The Sutherland material is probably the best known, since it is some of the finest, most evenly produced, and most complex of the Shetland lace knitting tradition. The repertoire of the patterns used in these garments were recorded by Julia Sutherland toward the end of her life in 1951 in a sampler she knit in cotton. A complete photographic sequence of the sampler survives, and a few years ago, I asked a colleague to join the photographs together to create a picture of the complete sampler, as you see here. Many of these stitches were used time and again in various combinations by the Sutherlands at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Some of these stitches can be found in 19th century pattern books. Shetland lace from before the 1880s is rare, or dating is uncertain. But one garment in particular does have a provenance which dates it to 1851, since it was shown in the Great Exhibition that year. It's on display in the upper gallery. It's made of 3 main stitches in vertical panels for the center. The 2 stitches in white are open zigzag with spider net centers and a pattern forming triangles against an open ground. Both of these patterns are pictured in Gauguin's accompaniment to her second volume of Knitting, Netting, and Crochet from 1844. The triangle stitch seems to have been used in the center of this unusual shawl photographed in 1952 by an unknown maker. Gauguin's Van Dyck of 3 holes is a pattern motif in Shetland lace. Here it is used in a shawl from the last decade of the 19th century, knit by the Sutherlands in the lower left. And the same motif is used in the shawl worn on the right, possibly dating to as early as the 1870s. Here Gauguin does not identify it as Shetland, but it is used in Shetland knitting nonetheless. Were many of Gauguin's patterns copied from Shetland garments? Or were Shetland's knitters in contact with knitting manuals and lace garments produced on the British mainland? Rosalind will speak further on this issue in the next paper. Shetland Museum's collection policy states that we only accept items of direct relevance to Shetland history and culture. Whenever a textile donation is offered to us, the first thing I must ask is, what is its relation to Shetland? In other words, is it authentic? For some items, it's obvious, but for others, where provenance is sketchy, the knitting itself does not always provide a clear answer. As we know, Shetland lace knitters made garments in cotton, silk, and mohair, as well as wool from various sources. Knitters on the British mainland also used these materials and were able to purchase hand-spun Shetland lace-weight wool. Using the pattern books available, an expert knitter like Gauguin would have been able to produce garments which might be difficult to separate from those made in Shetland. Which of these is the authentic Shetland lace? Just like Lynn's glove. Or could they both be considered such, especially if the pattern writers copied motifs from Shetland-made garments? One of the clear differences between any of the published patterns and garments of Shetland origin is the multiplicity of patterns used in the latter. The pattern writers, with the exception of only a few, were offering one stitch for an entire shawl. Gauguin and Riego de la Branchardière designed slightly more complex shawls and scarves, using sometimes up to 3 patterns in a garment, one for the edge, one for the border, and a third for the center. By contrast, most Shetland lace is far more complex, as you see here. Using many different patterns within and around each other, such knitting would have been difficult for an early pattern writer to present, and the buyers of such patterns would likely have been few. Women who wished to wear the most exquisite Shetland garment simply bought them. Those who could not afford them simply made do with less quality garments or simpler ones they could make themselves. After all, the pattern writers wanted to sell books to the widest audience possible. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say a really big thanks to all of the knitters who kindly participated in this project. Rosalind and I are now in discussions about how to take this project forward. But for the time being, the samples will stay in Shetland, and they're going to be used as study aids for our collection and for collections around Shetland, including Shetland Textile Museum and Unst Heritage Centre. Thanks very much. Good. Do we? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could.
I think we have time for some questions. So, would anyone like to? Yeah.
No questions? Okay.
Okay.
We can wait till after
Yeah.
Rosalind's. Next up is Rosalind Chapman, who you've heard about so far several times. And Rosalind and I have worked diligently together since she was selected as PhD candidate, which was some years ago now, actually, it seems. Anyway, she's finished her PhD, yay. And, but as usual with PhDs, just as you get it finished, there's more to do, and you carry on, and you take things further, and that's what she's doing now. So we'll hear how she's doing that. You've got the mic on.
I have, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I would just also like to say a quick thank you to all of our knitters. They were fabulous. They complied with everything that we asked, generally. They responded to all my emails promptly. I'm sure many of them were absolutely sick of hearing my final words of very many thanks and best wishes, because that's what I put at the end of everything. We're in the process of compiling statistics, so at some point in the near future we'll let everyone know all the different countries that people came from, how many people from different countries, lots of demographics, so that it's quite nice to be able to see exactly who participated in everything. Excuse me, wrong glasses on. So thank you. A few weeks ago, Brian Smith, the archivist here in Shetland Museum, sent me a copy of a very intriguing document he'd come across in the course of cataloguing the AI Tulloch collection. It was a very interesting thing, but of special interest to me in particular was a very brief handwritten sentence at the bottom of the page. Shetland is the most profitable term in the woolen trade. This didn't come as a surprise to me, having spent 4 years researching Shetland lace. Nevertheless, the document is undated, But this sentiment could easily apply to any period during the 18th to 21st centuries. Shetland sells. Of that there is no doubt. And there is perhaps no better way of understanding this than recognising the development and rise of the not made in Shetland trade. And this is where I've been researching at the moment, the Shetland lace industry in England, which you'd be surprised was very big. While researching the history of Shetland lace, what interested me the most was how lace was presented in newspaper columns and advertisements. These documentary sources provided me, and this is not a sarcastic comment, fun-filled afternoons reading different ways businesses said they could promote Shetland lace. The wording of the advertisements often included extra words to describe the article. For example, real, genuine, ordinary, imitation. Imitation caught my attention. As well as references to hand-knitted and perhaps more surprisingly to me at least, machine-knitted. And this is what I would like to talk about today. The first half of the talk, I'll just do a quick, because it's very short, quick whistle-stop tour of the production of Shetland lace in English manufacturing towns such as Hucknall Torkard, can't say that, and Beeston. Both of these are in Nottinghamshire. However, it should be noted that many of the comments that I'll make in the second part of the paper, where I discuss the steps to counteract this competition, are actually equally applicable to all of Shetland knitting, not just Shetland lace. The exact origins, at this point I'll also make a brief apology. You've seen lots of lovely pretty pictures. I don't have lots of lovely pretty pictures because I don't really have any of these articles at present, so I'm going to research. The images I'm going to show you are sometimes a bit fuzzy because they're taken from very old newspapers, but I would like you to actually see the words in print. The exact origins of the Shetland lace industry are not clear-cut, but it's generally accepted that production began in the 1830s, with advertisements in 1838 noting that real curiosities of Shetland knitting were available for purchase in Edinburgh. By 1841, Shetland lace shawls were becoming more widely available and gaining in popularity. As the nature of fashion, and indeed the nature of capitalism, the popularity of Shetland lace did not go unnoticed, and soon a second Shetland lace industry appeared, somewhat different from the original, but one which would make a direct impact on Shetland. Depending on which source you choose to acknowledge, the Nottingham Shetland lace shawl industry, because that is what they called themselves, began either shortly after 1848, when Henry Rhodes set up his, and this is the name of his business, the Nottingham Shetland Shawl and Fall business, or 1852, when James Wood bought a knitted fall in Shetland and asked a stocking maker, Robert Whittleson in Nottingham, if he would copy it on a knitting frame. Whichever is your preferred origin story, the Nottinghamshire Shetland hosiery industry formed, developed, expanded and excelled. And you'll see in the second part down, large stock of white Nottingham Shetland shawls. This would become more and more common. Imitation Shetland shawls, veils and falls were machine produced in larger and larger quantities. And they were sold extensively throughout Britain and overseas. The popularity of this industry is attested not only by the number of Shetland shawl manufacturing businesses in Nottingham, but also by the number of businesses advertising them for sale. In 1864, G.W. Vogel, a Philadelphia department store, quite an important department store in Philadelphia, sold two types of Shetland shawls, real and ordinary. But they do explain. The real were Shetland hand knit, so that's okay. They sold for $25 to $30 each. The ordinary were knit by machinery and sold for $7 each. Note the difference in the price. While machine-made lace was outproducing the hand-knitted lace, Lace manufacturer and exhibitor at the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition, William Felkin, noted that with regard to the burgeoning fine Shetland shawl industry in Nottingham workshops, other machine-knit Shetland lace manufacturers in other parts of the country had jeopardised their demand by infringing upon the quality and selling their products at lower prices. Wow. Felkins is completely unaware of the somewhat hypocritical stance he's taking here. His contemporary analysis of the competitive production methods taking place in Nottingham could easily have been applied to the impact that Nottingham's machine-knitted Shetland shawl production had on the Shetland hand-knitting producers. 7 years later, reporting on the lace exhibits at the 1874 International Exhibition, Mrs. Barry Palliser itemised Nottingham's workshop machine-produced lace. She included a list of the Shetland goods made on the lace frame, but she noted that this was an admirable reproduction by intricate machinery of the labour of human hands. In 1874, much of this admirable reproduction by machinery was at the expense of the labour of Shetland women's hands. The tables would soon turn, though. By March 1879, it was also at the expense of the Nottingham shawl producers. Reports appeared that once extensive American markets were now under threat, as the US had recently begun their own manufacture of Shetland shawls. So we now have Shetland everywhere in the world. They had rich designs and styles and lace effects which were especially attractive. They were produced in a variety of colours. The borders were rich and tasteful. They were beautiful and elegant. And they manufactured them in 3 grades: cheap, middle-priced and very expensive. While Shetland and national newspapers regularly reported on the serious detrimental effect that these goods were having on the Shetland knitters, goods that were bearing a close resemblance to Shetland lace productions, the Nottingham newspapers reported boom times and brisk trade. This is just a few examples from a period where the Scotsman in particular reports year after year how difficult Shetland lace producers are experiencing in the market. There were even claims that at one time G.H. Hurt, a business that some people might know in Nottingham, produced Shetland shawls. They produced Shetland shawls from 1912, sold Shetland shawls to the Shetlands. Okay, there's no comment as to who bought them or why, so we have to take that with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, as business boomed, an increase in workforce was required. Now, these are just a few examples from the Situations Vacant column in the Nottingham Evening Post. A quick look through their columns. Every week there are pages of advertisements requesting people to work in the Shetland shawl industry. Advertisements for Shetland shawl makers, stitchers, dressers. These appeared on a regular basis. Indeed, the number of workers employed in the Shetland shawl manufacturing business in Nottingham was such that they formed the Shetland Shawl Trade Union. I don't actually know anything more about that yet. That's something I'm working on at the moment. Like the sellers of Shetland-produced lace, the Nottingham manufacturers capitalised on celebrity and royal purchases of their products. In 1935, the brisk trade in Shetland shawls had been assisted by the purchase of an imitation Shetland shawl by the Duchess of Kent. This was purchased for the royal baby. As Shetland shawls had been produced in Hucknall since the 1850s, it's unsurprising that royals would offer patronage to a long-standing British textile producer. However, the Duchess would certainly have been fully aware that she was buying an item that had no connection to Shetland. Earlier in the year, she had received a marriage gift containing 15 hand-knitted Shetland articles, which included this Shetland shawl. Well, perhaps not this exact one, but because there was 2 made, I don't know which photograph this refers to, the earlier one or hers. Designed by David Sutherland, hand-knitted by Joan Sutherland, from wool handspun by Anne Sutherland, this incredible shawl took a year to make. The Duchess was aware that Shetland shawls existed. Here, the purchaser is completely aware of the distinction between the two products. However, for many of the consuming public, this is perhaps less clear. It therefore became necessary to indicate the original and authentic Shetland in advertising literature. The assertion of authenticity on Shetland knitted goods began earlier than might be expected, with the simple insertion of the word real. An advertisement in the Liverpool Mercury in January 1821 notes that W.J. Ward was selling real Shetland hose and gloves, which were recommended, I love this, by the Faculty for Gouty. Dramatic complaints. This refers to hose. The first known appendage of real to shawls is 1845, and bizarrely in Australia, where a few truly elegant real Shetland shawls were offered for sale. 1845 is before any known mass production of non-Shetland shawls. So this is quite an unusual one that to me would indicate that these are perhaps, if they're indicating real, then they're not real, or perhaps hand-knitted at this point. Nevertheless, only 1 year later, in 1846, I'm sorry, these are quite difficult to say, the Aberdeen Journal noted the sale of both real and imitation shawls at the same time, so you could go in and make your choice. It is noteworthy the difference in price of them both. Similarly, in 1863, the Scotch Worsted and Shetland Warehouse in London advertised a clearing sale of Shetland shawls at 1 and 6 each, but real Shetland veils at 2 and 6 and 3 and 6 each. Again, note the difference in the price. The real Shetland veils were higher priced than the lace Shetland shawls. Shetland knitted veils had been available in Edinburgh from 1843. However, as with shawls, not all Shetland veils were authentic. In response to a letter sent to the English Women's Domestic Magazine in 1853 on where to get the best Shetland veil, MB, who I believe is Vrego de la Branchardier, informed her inquiring reader that her black knitted Shetland veil had been made in Ireland. Vrego did have Irish connections, so she was perhaps promoting Ireland. From this perspective, it's clear why Shetland lace required confirmation of authenticity, and the inclusion of the word real became increasingly commonplace to differentiate Shetland hand-knitted lace from the machine-knitted variety. So here at this point, we have Shetland, real Shetland and imitation Shetland. However, further differentiations were made. In 1900, Toronto-based Drunkato, in addition to selling real Shetland, also sold Orenburg shawls as imitation Shetland. This confusion of Shetland with Russian Orenburg shawls is perhaps best explained by the 1884 publication of machine-knitted Orenburg shawls in the same Nottingham factories that were producing machine-knitted Shetland shawls. Just to confuse the matter a little bit further, in this case we have inauthentic Orenburg being sold as inauthentic Shetland. I'm not sure where to go with this one yet. I'm open to suggestions. As The Economist notes, authenticity is the secret of success. Once you can fake it, you've got it made. The need to authenticate Shetland lace from other productions continued well into the 20th century, often focusing on the hand-knitted, as illustrated in one 1907 advertisement for Moll & Son. Oh, sorry, I meant to show you, I wanted to show you a nice picture and I didn't have any, so I put a veil in. Which used real 3 times. Moll & Sons loved the word real. Used real 3 times, as well as guaranteed and genuine, with reference to the articles being hand-knitted. The 1924 advertisement guaranteed every Shetland article as authentic, continuing with the emphasis on real hand-knit. This overt use of real and genuine indicates that there was a consumer base who desired the authentic over the machine-produced. However, whether this was purely for aesthetic purposes or part of the purchasing ideology of the 1920s, similar to that as at the end of the 20th century, or even the 19th century, is unclear. But the 1920s also saw the inclusion of the term machine-made appear in advertisements. However, the only newspaper I found machine-made Shetland shawls is in Aberdeen, which I find quite interesting too. While it might seem reasonable that businesses on the British mainland and overseas required this inclusion of real as an assurance, it's somewhat odd that the merchants dealing in and operating out of Shetland would be required to make these same assurances. Nevertheless, Shetland merchants were not immune to the need to specify the authenticity of the goods that they were selling. In 1862, William Johnson noted in the Shetland Advertiser that he was a manufacturer of real Shetland lace veils and shawls. From that point until 1939, 15 individual Shetland businesses described their knitted articles as real. Concerns regarding the production of imitation goods was an ongoing issue among Shetland producers and merchants alike. The 1887 Merchandisers' Mark concluded that where a location, such as Shetland, was used as a brand identifier, but which did not originate in that place, this was considered to be a description that was intentionally calculated to mislead consumers. In the report, Shetland shawls are specifically mentioned. However, this Act only applies to imported goods, not goods produced within the British Isles. As such, the naming of Leicester wool as Shetland wool, or Nottingham shawls as Shetland, was still misleading, but not actually illegal. In defence, speaking to the Select Committee, Sir Albert Rollitt stated that Shetland shawls and the like were such words that after a time might become generic and harmlessly used. For this was undoubtedly not the case. The 1903 Scotsman reported that the demand for lace was falling off at an alarming rate, that higher priced shawls were becoming too difficult to sell. The blame was placed on the market being flooded with cheap factory-made goods bearing too close a resemblance to those of Shetland manufacture. By 1914, the Scots report to the Board of Agriculture and Home Industries acknowledged that unscrupulous dealings by businesses on the British mainland were an ongoing issue, but by no means a new one. To overcome the problems of imitation Shetland goods, Scott suggested introducing a trademark, overseen by an independent body, which would show consumers the provenance of the article by authenticating the origin. Scott recognised the issues surrounding this misdescription of factory-produced Shetland lace and the likelihood that this was diverting demand from the authentic productions. Nevertheless, he considered imitation goods not only a part of normal commercial enterprise, but also a tribute to the excellence and reputation of the Shetland knitters. He declared that as long as there were means of identifying the genuine thing, the flooding of the market with imitations tended to act as an advertisement, and it was only in exceptional circumstances that the cheap substitute might destroy the demand for the original. The circumstances being the case of articles of fashion or personal adornment. Unfortunately, Shetland lace, as articles of fashion and personal adornment, did indeed face this decline. But it would be 1925 before Shetland finally received its trademark. In addition to guiding consumers to the authentic article, the trademark shielded the identity of the lace from imitations masquerading as the authentic. So the Shetland Woolen Industries Association was formed. Its success was debatable. It was formed with the recommendation that the country inspectors should be in a position which was independent of both merchants and workers. Acknowledging the difficulty of finding independent inspectors in a geographical location where the vast majority of people in some way work in the trade, the choices of sub-inspectors is still somewhat unusual. Of the 3 sub-inspectors for Unst in 1926, one was a Shetland hosiery dealer, and the other, Lizzie J. Spence of Dandy's Yearsound, was a knitter whose name appears in the ledger as having knitted and submitted Spencer's shawls, nightdresses and petticoats for her own inspection, authentication and labelling. Well, I suppose she knew they were authentic because she had knitted them. So where does this leave us? All over the place, really. When a Shetland lace article has an established Shetland provenance, regardless of the article's quality, design or material, it's unquestionably Shetland. We accept that. Where no provenance is available, the issue of authenticity is somewhat problematic. If a Shetland-style lace shawl exhibits typical designs and motifs but has no provenance, determining its authenticity is doubtful at best. And we saw that in Carol's paper. Understanding the authenticity of a Shetland lace article is fundamental in understanding the industry, both within Shetland and further afield with regard to the external capitalisation of Shetland lace, notably by non-Shetland businesses producing machine-knit Shetland lace. The appendage Shetland gave a distinct identity to the knitted article. However, like the pattern book authors discussed by Carol, it's unknown whether these early manufacturers copied Shetland lace shawls or simply ascribed a Shetland label because of their general style. There is, of course, a third possibility, that due to the increasing popularity of Shetland lace, the provision of a Shetland designation was a calculated business decision. Much of the appeal of authentic Shetland lace is in its handcrafted quality, the skill and expert eye of the spinner and knitter, and the individual design of every article that left the islands. That so many machine-knit lace shawls were produced and sold indicates that there was a place for them too. There was a market for both Shetland and non-Shetland produced lace knitted articles. For me, the issue is that they were labelled Shetland, and this identity was used as a marketing strategy to effect sales to a specific sector of the consumer market. Rather than machine-knitted woolen lace, or even fine machine-knitted woolen lace, in recognising the marketability of Shetland, the Nottingham businesses chose to make and market them specifically as Shetland, and this not only impinged on the authentic article, they also became Shetland's direct competition in the marketplace. In light of this, I believe we have to acknowledge that there were, in fact, 2 Shetland lace industries operating simultaneously. Without doubt, the machine-manufactured Shetland lace came second. And as such, the Shetland-produced lace is the authentic, or perhaps we may call it the original authentic. I don't know how else to call it, though. By creating and successfully maintaining its own consumer base, Nottingham-produced Shetland lace developed its own authenticity. For those who actively sought out the shawls, they were buying their own personal authentic. Recognising and defining the authentic is fraught with difficulties, but it can reap tremendous rewards with regard to understanding the history and development of a textile industry. Recognising and defining the secondary authentic. See, now I've got original authentic, secondary authentics, am I confusing you yet? Can provide a further but very valuable insight into the original. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, both industries have maintained their own unique identities. This makes it possible to reflect on the shifting relationship between individuals and communities across time and geographical distance. Individuals and communities with a shared but different history. Defining this relationship between the two is a difficult task. Both have carefully curated identities, which are neither mutual nor distinct. Shetland fine lace knitters still produce fine lace in Shetland. Some of the Nottingham businesses remain in the area and remain producing. They've endured the test of time, albeit with variations in naming the products they sell. They no longer sell Shetland shawls. Now it's the heritage range. But at least they've stopped calling it Shetland. But they still produce the shawls purchased by doting duchesses for royal babies. If I might, I would like to leave you with a conundrum I'm currently working on. I have a bad feeling that I didn't move forward in my slides. I did. This is something that I'm working on at the moment. Anyone who's ever heard me speak in Shetland before will realise that at the end, when I say any questions, I'm not actually referring to the audience asking me questions, but referring to the fact that I have a lot of questions for the audience. As the people who are most aware of what's going on in the knitting world and lace traditions, I usually have a whole gamut of questions prepared for them. This is my question of today. In the advertisements, we have the word real, which incorporates the authentic and the genuine. That's acceptable. We have machine knit, imitation and ordinary, unusual, which refer to articles not produced in Shetland. If we view, which we don't normally, but if we view authenticity as linear, with inauthentic and authentic as opposing poles, where does this fall? This is for Anderson's warehouses in Glasgow. Real imitation Shetland shawls. I have only found one of these so far, but I am open to any suggestions about what you might think that would refer to. Thank you.
Have we got any questions for Rosalind or Lynn or I? Yes? Oh, yeah, we need the microphone.
This is a question for Rosalind. I wondered if you'd come across any evidence of the, particularly Nottingham manufacturers, recruiting in Shetland for Shetland lace workers to add authenticity by the persons doing it?
I haven't. It has been something that I've been thinking about, though. However, it does appear that all the advertisements that I've found for the situations vacant have all been in local, regional newspapers. So it looks like they're employing from an already captive audience of people whose maybe families work in the industry. But it would be interesting to see if maybe they were outside recruiting as well.
Any other questions?
Well, I was thinking about that too. I think that's really interesting, and it would be interesting to look at the sort of indigenous development of the skills in Nottinghamshire in that particular town as well, I suppose. And I really wondered what those, mainly women, or I think there were some men advertised for there too, were doing. Presumably they were finishing, and they were, I don't know what they were doing.
I mean, it appears that the shawls were made on frames, so they were machine made, but there were people employed to do the finishing and the dressing of the shawls. It's something that I'm still looking into. So I don't actually know the demographics of the people that were working in the industry. Something that caught my eye, though, when I was watching Carol's presentation was 2 weeks ago when I was on the Borders looking at Peter Scott's machine knitted things, and I bought a cashmere scarf. Not for me, for my sister for her birthday. Oh, she's not watching. It's machine knitted lace, But it's the same pattern when you put up the three. I can't remember which one it was now that said, you said, none of these appear in Shetland.
Probably the leaf.
The leaf, and I thought,
Okay.
that's the same pattern as I've just purchased.
I've got a comment really. I don't know whether I don't suppose you'd be able to answer this, but I was actually struck by the prices. And you said, oh, look at the difference in price. But the difference in price actually was not that huge between the real and the machine knitted. So if you think about, I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but you know, the amount of labour that goes into hand knitting and the eventual price never reflects the labour that goes into it. So actually the price differential between those two things was really quite small, it seemed to me. Would you agree?
No, I would agree that certainly in all the advertisements for real Shetland, there's never a decent price set on them for sale. But of course, much of that would come down to the business selling it, that they're marketing it to an audience that they know what they can sell it at. And unfortunately, a lot of the Shetland knitters would have been held to ransom. You take the money or you don't take the money.
Not a question as such, but an anecdote, if you like. I recently had a family had been contacted by someone, and they said, we have in our family a shawl that was knitted by your grandmother. And if you would like it back, it will cost you £600.
That was generous of them.
Just
Oh,
what she got for it.
Shillings.
Have you got any percentage of the difference between what a local knitter got, which is mostly tea or something like that, but between that and what the eventual price was and what the middleman got? Have you got any kind of figures?
That's really difficult to calculate because I know what some knitters earned and I know what some businesses sold at, but I don't know which knitters went through which businesses. I mean, like, for example, I have lists of knitters that I know produced for John White in Edinburgh, but I don't have the records of what he paid them. Occasionally, there is a snippet of information that you can manage to join up, but unfortunately, these are few and far between. For example, at the Edinburgh exhibition, when John White asked for an opera cloak to be made, it was made in Unst. And we know that the knitter, what the knitter was paid, and what John White paid, which was exactly the same, because although Alexander Sanderson worked as a middleman in that case, he never took any cut in it at all. John White directly paid the knitter. But it would be great to be able to know where that. Although actually I do have one other example. I know that Alexander Sanderson added a couple of shillings to a shawl once that he forwarded on, but the shawl itself was like £3.10. I think he sold it on for £3.12. You know, so it wasn't like an excessive thing that he did.
I was just wondering, like more kind of a technical question. See the machine knit ones, the shawls people were making, was that just like, was everything hand tooled on them? Was it just a frame machine and people were hand?
Machines.
So was there difference? I mean, there's things even you can do just hand tooling that you can't replicate.
My problem is I don't know what any of these imitation shawls looked like.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. If you had any pictures of a...
I had two images which I didn't put up because I can't date them. For all I know, they could have been 1990 productions because the person who put them in their book didn't bother to date them and doesn't answer their emails. But there must be shawls out there just waiting to be found. The problem with The problem with knitted garments, as you're all aware, is that you buy them to wear them, and they disintegrate after time and they become a variety of different things. A lot of the Shetland lace survives because of the value, rather than the monetary value, the emotional or the sentimental value that's attached to these shawls being hand knitted, often given as very special gifts or as part of family heirlooms. Whereas if you're purchasing a machine knit shawl for a couple of shillings, yeah, it's maybe like the equivalent of, I don't want to say a business, the equivalent of a reduced item department store, where you would buy it and you would wear it until it started to fall apart and then wouldn't care much about it after that. So I haven't found any yet, but I do actually have good hopes of finding them. And
I'd like to see one to see how it compares.
I'm desperate to know if there is actually any Shetland in these. I mean,
Well, one also wonders whether these early pattern books, which from the 1840s onward published a lot of patterns in there, but many of them that they called Shetland, if that's what the machine knitting industry was using to create. In other words, the shawl behind Rosalind is a Gauguin design, and that's considered a fairly complicated thing to knit because it's got 3 patterns in it. But for a Shetland knitter, that's nothing. That's simple, that's really basic. But that might be able to be translated into machine knitting, and therefore they can call it Shetland because Gauguin calls it Shetland and the stitches are found in Shetland, but it really doesn't look anything like a Shetland shawl as such.
And that leaf stitch you were speaking about just a minute ago, that on my list carriage, on my knit machine, that's one of the easiest ones to do.
right, see, right.
And I think that's very much like that picture you
That
had.
was when I was watching that, and I've seen, I processed all those samples, so I don't know why my bazinga moment happened exactly when I was sitting there. I thought, hold on, maybe it's been surrounded by knitters that just, I don't know, I got your vibes. I absorbed the ability to understand patterns by osmosis. I'm not a knitter, I'm afraid. When I saw that though, and I suddenly thought, perhaps actually, this is a sample, this is a pattern that Peter Scott has been maybe using for 100 years. And this has been one of the original patterns in a shawl, which would play very nicely into our pattern book project, if it is.
One of the earliest lace knitting machines was made by a man called Lee, am I right? Yeah. He supposedly came to Shetland and took 6 of our Shetland lace patterns to be reproduced on the machine. Do you have that?
No.
I might have it somewhere.
No, I don't.
I forget numbers, I forget years. It's early.
I thought Lee was awful early though.
He is early, yeah.
Because, I mean...
If I found the information, I would have the date on it.
Does anybody know when I thought the Lee machine was in the 1600s?
1600s is what's in my head.
Whereas the first indication that we have of Shetland lace is in the 1830s. We don't have any... I mean, certainly there's loads of references to very fine work, but no reference to lace work prior to the 1830s. But it's worth having a look into, because sometimes these little stories that pass down, there's some snippet behind it that's...
Any other questions?
We have a question via Twitter from the Woolsack UK asking, was there any indication if real Shetland lace had to be knitted using wool from Shetland breed sheep from Shetland?
Okay. No. That is the short answer to that. When I first started looking at authenticity in Shetland, I had a list of questions and criteria which I believed should fit with the word. It was my decision. It should be knitted by a Shetlander, it should be knitted in Shetland wool, it should follow traditional Shetland patterns or styles or motifs, and if it took on new patterns, styles and motifs, it should at least be produced by a Shetlander creating these new designs. However, as early as the 1840s, I found people knitting Shetland veils in mohair. And then in the 50s, they're knitting in cotton and silk. In the 70s, they're knitting in anything that they can lay their hands on. A lot of them didn't have very many choices. If you were an independent, if you owned sheep, then you could produce your own yarn and you could knit in very fine yarn. The competition for fine yarn, though, was fierce. And it was a monetary item. So if you didn't have the cash to buy it, then you had no options but to use whichever yarn the shop gave to you. And if you were an outworker for a shop, you had no option but to knit in whichever yarns they specified. They used yarns that were specified by market forces in the south. So if a business in the south said, we want 5 Shetland lace shawls all knitted in black silk, then they would try and find people to knit them in silk. So unfortunately, the material used I had to remove from the criteria of authenticity because, well, the Shetland knitters were knitting in everything. So if we said only Shetland wool, we would have eliminated all of them too.
So can I ask Carol a question? Because when I started thinking about this authenticity question, though it depends on where you're coming from, right? It depends on who's making that judgment. So as a museum curator, you presumably have a set of criteria that you would use to judge authenticity. But of course, someone else, me shopping in Edinburgh, perhaps, or shopping on the internet, would have a different set of criteria for what I might regard as authenticity. So I wonder whether you could give us an idea of what the museum's position would be.
Well, as I mentioned in my talk briefly, we only collect items for our collection that have a relationship to Shetland. But that doesn't mean they have to be made in Shetland or made by a Shetlander. I tend to look at not just the garment, but the story behind the garment. For example, we received a donation of what you would call a shawl, a christening shawl, made probably in the 1960s. It was purchased on the Scottish mainland. It was, according to the purchaser, knit by a Shetland lady who lived there, but the wool was machine made. Now, the woman who purchased the shawl did so while she was on a trip with her husband touring the Highlands, and she was pregnant at the time. And she bought the shawl, her husband bought it for her as a christening gift, a christening shawl for their upcoming baby. Well, she lost that child, but she kept the shawl. And she went on to have 2 more children who were christened in that shawl, but when she donated the shawl, she told us this story. And that, to me, is the most important thing about that. Not that it was not made in Shetland or not made out of Shetland wool, but that it had a huge amount of meaning as a christening shawl in Shetland patterns made by Shetlander for that person. So I accepted that into the collection. Other curators might not have done so, but I felt that that was really an important thing about that item. So the story behind the object is often as important as the object itself, but sometimes we get things in that are from a charity shop and we know nothing about them, and it's sometimes really difficult to say, was it made in Shetland? I tend to err on the side of caution, but we probably do have things in our collection that really don't have very little at all to do with Shetland. And that's for future curators to sort out, really.
If I could just expand on that a little bit. or just add a comment to that. Can I have you hold this? This is a shawl that was donated by a lovely gentleman who asked me to bring it up to Shetland and hand over to Rhoda for the Unst Heritage Centre. And you will know I have brought it, although I won't lie, I was tempted to pretend that it hadn't arrived. This was knitted by two Unst knitters in the 1960s, Lizzie Priest and Jackie and Lizzie Priest. They were visited by a man who worked for a wool supplier, and he went to speak to them. He went to speak to them about gutting. He was interested in gutting. He worked in the yarn industry, but he was interested in gutting. Anyway, the two ladies spent a substantial amount of time with him speaking about his interest. When he left, he was very taken with them. So when he got back, he sent them the yarn that he sold. Now, this is not Shetland yarn. This is, I have it written down, and for the life of me, I can't remember. It's a cross merino and something else, but it's millspun. Anyway, he sent it to them as a gift, as a thank you for taking the time to speak to him. He sent them quite a lot. So with some of the yarn, they knitted him a shawl and sent it back to him. He was like, wow. And now he lives in Canada, and he decided that before he went to Canada, he would like the shawl to be returned to Shetland, and I'm bringing it for Rhoda. So it raises on that, you know, it's not knit with Shetland wool, it's knit with a different yarn, millspun, but it is knitted by Shetland knitters, and it is quite lovely. It's beautiful. Oh! I'll just sit here with you. Excuse me, I'm destroying the place. Can I just hand that to you while I...
I had a question for Carol as well. I was just interested in the samples, or the knitted samples, because I did one myself, which I had a lot of trouble with, and I now see that mine doesn't look anything like the one that's on display out there, so I didn't manage to make sense out of it. But I just wondered how much that happened, or was it just me in this case?
Oh, I need... See, I need the mic. Well, when I got all the samples from Rosalind, they came in dribs and drabs, but I organized them by the pattern writer initially, and then by pattern. So I had like all of Lambert's 12, I had out in 12 piles. And I went through them to see how they compared with each other, because of course I hadn't knit all the samples myself, so I didn't know. And we had that was the only record of what that pattern was meant to look like. Anything that looked really unusual, I set aside. But generally, the patterns did look like each other. It was difficult sometimes to tell because the yarns were so different and gauges were very different. But generally, you know, you could tell that, okay, all these people, they must be right because they've all knit it in the same way. But there were a few that were oddities, I would say. I can't remember what yours looked like. I didn't put any of those up. And some of them, I checked to see where they may have gone wrong in the pattern. And of course, because these patterns have rather unusual language for knitting, I could see how some people got off on the wrong track. We had some emails from people who asked us, how do I interpret what this means? And so then we went through the pattern, and I would email and say, well, you know, this is what it means in today's knitting language. And then they carried on. So, yeah, so I hope that answered your question.
We have another Twitter question from Joanne Karma. Is there copyright in Shetland design, Shetland made, Shetland yarn? What is the law on such things?
Over to you, Karen.
No, the short answer is no, there isn't. There have been various attempts over the years to brand Shetland woolen goods in various ways, but a lot of the producers here are quite independent and work separately, and they don't fall under one major brand like Harris Tweed does, for example. That's just never really been completely established. It was occasionally in Shetland, it happened, but then it sort of fell by the wayside. So people today in Shetland making Shetland woolen garments tend to just have their own label and their own branding, but there's no sort of copyright over anything in particular, really. I mean, individuals who make knitting patterns, of course, can copyright those, but if you change a stitch or something and use a different wool or whatever, then it changes it altogether. So it's a really difficult thing to monitor and to take control of. Right, Sue had a question.
Hello. I was just wondering, when commercially spun, really fine yarn first became available, because my mother had to send in the late 70s up to the Shetland wool brokers to get their commercial one-ply yarn for fine knitting.
Okay, I'm going to be honest. I don't know. I don't know if you know, Carol. No. I mean, there was wool brokers coming up from the 1900s, but I don't know how earlier than that it was.
Yeah, and it's really hard to know really the qualities of early yarns. I mean, in the pattern books, they specify specific yarns, and sometimes they'll say things like Shetland wool, but they don't really, you have no idea how thick that is. But in the work that Rosalind's done in her PhD, she has looked at weights of yarns, and they are of the hand spun, and they're incredibly fine. So fine, some of them, that they're almost impossible to work. There must have been a market for Shetland hand spun woolen yarn going south, because it is talked about in the pattern books, and Gauguin has a little advert in some of her books that says, if you're trying to find Shetland wool to knit these garments, contact me if you're struggling. So she obviously had some way to access hand spun from Shetland. At some point in the 19th century, that there must be more and more machine spun, but we don't really know very much about it. They were importing yarns from Germany and places like that, which probably were machine made, but we don't know how thick they were, and we don't know what they looked like. That's the trouble.
With regard to the hand spun though, a lot of the correspondence that I've looked at, when people write looking for hand spun yarns to be sent south, they do know, they specify which cut they want and how thick or how fine the yarn is. So people are aware of the quality of the yarn, the standard and the fineness. But as for the machine, the mill spun, I'm not really sure.
I mean, Shetland mill spun really comes in right before the First World War, and there are adverts in the Shetland Times for women to go back to the spinning wheel and continue to hand spin, because that is the key to producing a real Shetland garment. And that the minute knitters start to use machine-made yarn from south, then it's no longer a real Shetland garment. But that didn't last very long, and really by the end of the First World War, you know, the amount of mill-spun yarn coming in for Shetland knitters was, well, there was a lot of it in lots of colors. So of course this helped the Fair Isle knitting industry in the 20s tremendously, because all you had to do was get knitting. You didn't have to spin it or dye it to begin with. So really the First World War is the period when that change really takes place in Shetland. And some of the businesses here struggle to find hand spinners. Because of course, if you're going to spend your time working with wool, you can make a lot more money knitting quickly and getting it out there than spinning. So, so that really, the hand spinning tradition really falls away at that time.
I was going to say, me and Caris were looking at shade cards the other day, and there's ones from definitely the early 70s, which has one ply cobweb on it. It's late 60s they started doing yarn, so I think pretty much from the beginning they must have had it available on shade cards.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, Elizabeth.
What really ultimately ended the hand spinning was that if a knitter made something in their own hand spun yarn, she wasn't paid any extra for that. She would be paid the same price if it was in mill spun yarn.
Any more questions? Any more tweets? No. Well, it's 10 to 12, and I think we could probably break for lunch now. I think we're meant to be back here at 1:30. Is that right?
Yes.
So you're free to go. Oh, one more tweet. One more tweet.
A tweet from Mostly Yolurker. I'm one of the sample knitters, and I'm wondering if any of the patterns we worked up have been identified as a real Shetland pattern or not, as in matching a pattern in the museum's collection.
Maybe that person missed my talk earlier, but some of them are matched with patterns in the collection, but there are many that are not. I'd have to look to see which pattern. If they email me or email Rosalind, we can answer them directly. That would be the best way, probably. Okay, so we'll see you back here at 1:30. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for this morning's speakers.
Thanks, you said the battery, but I don't know how.